Welcome to Charity Village Connects. Between the pandemic and shifting demographics that include an aging population, a perfect storm threatens the very foundation of Canada's nonprofit sector. Upwards of 65% of Canadian nonprofits are now facing a severe volunteer shortage. This lack of volunteers has led to the cancellation and suspension of critical programming, and in some cases, the closure of entire organizations. Considering that 58% of Canadian nonprofits are entirely volunteer run, it's clear that this sector can't afford to ignore this issue. In this episode of Charity Village Connects, we examine the most recent trends impacting volunteerism in Canada and how organizations are trying to meet these challenges. Joining me to discuss these important issues is Heather Johnson, President of PAVRO, or Professional Administrators of Volunteer Resources. Heather also works as Director of Volunteer Halton, sharing her knowledge and expertise with nonprofits and their leaders in Halton Region and the City of Hamilton. In 2022, she received the PAVRO President's Award for her work on PAVRO's advocacy and certification portfolios. Welcome to the podcast, Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary, for having me.
Well, let's start by checking in on the current state of volunteerism in Canada. We're hearing about really dramatic shifts in the number of volunteers and how they're choosing to spend their time giving back. Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing?
For sure. There's definitely been a challenge and a change in how people want to give their time, how they want to be involved. Some of these changes have been driven by the pandemic. Other changes have just been driven by shifts in attitudes toward, what makes meaningful volunteer engagement for folks. Pre-pandemic, virtual volunteering, remote volunteering, has been a thing for over a decade. But, the pandemic really pulled it forward very forcefully and very dramatically to the forefront. And so now that we're sort of back to, I can't say back to normal, but we're moving forward out of the pandemic. Organizations are trying to find that balance. Individuals are trying to find that balance between what is going to continue to say hybrid, what can go back to the way that we were used to doing things, and what are the new things that are coming forward. For organizations, as a whole, they're going to need to revisit their volunteer opportunities, and revision some of those roles to meet people where they are now. Certainly people's abilities to volunteer as they once did have changed. And change is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean an adaptation, both by the organization, the leaders of volunteers, and the volunteers themselves.
As president of PAVRO, you represent professional administrators of volunteer resources or volunteer managers. Can you talk about what happened to these professionals during the pandemic and where things are today? What are you hearing from your members?
So certainly, as you mentioned off the top, 65% of organizations have been impacted. There's that huge change and challenge that's occurring. And that trickled all the way down through the staff levels, definitely to the leaders of volunteers, to volunteer managers. They were dramatically impacted during the pandemic. It's estimated that 1 in 2 volunteer, leaders of volunteers was either redeployed, had their hours reduced, or were laid off during the pandemic. So there was both an implosion and an explosion happening, in Canada's volunteer sector at the exact same time. You had some essential services needing more people, more paid and unpaid folks to deliver those essential services. And then you had other services that were completely shuttered with no idea of when or if they would reopen, and if they were to reopen, would they look the same? And the challenge around, what happened with our leaders of volunteers is a challenging one for me because we lost a lot of folks. There was that change. There was, if you don't have volunteers engaged in your programs, some organizations for financial reasons or others, made the decision that, at this time, maybe we don't need our volunteer managers. And they moved on and found other work. And some have moved into completely different sectors. And this is a bit of a challenge for me because on one hand, we've lost that fantastic skill set and that history and that knowledge from this from this body of professionals. But on the other hand, it's a validation of the skills and the talents that these people have, that this truly is a profession, and that those skills are in demand in other sectors. So, that's a bit of a challenge for me, just being in the role that I'm in. I want people to remain and be involved with volunteers, but in our struggle and in our advocacy around the fact that we are a profession, that this is, there are real skills, and there are knowledge that is inherent into what this role does, and how this role impacts an organization as a whole. The fact that other sectors are seeing the value of that is also, it kind of helps our cause to a point. But it as for volunteers, for leaders of volunteers, based on what's happening now, it really depends on the subsector. In healthcare, some of our members are telling us that at most hospitals, volunteers have not returned into all areas that they might have been pre-pandemic. There are certainly some hospitals that kept volunteers throughout the entire pandemic, and I have spoken to some members who they're just welcoming volunteers back now in 2023. In food services, the majority are now running with sort of a full contingent of volunteers. And again, indeed, some programs actually never stopped engaging them. 2023 has seen the return of most of our in-person events, our fundraising events, our walkathons, and our cultural celebrations on scales that we haven't seen since 2019 or early 2020. So slowly things are ramping back up, but not all organizations have gone back to actually engaging leaders of volunteers in the same way that they did prior to March of 2020.
So you've addressed a really critical issue, it seems, about this loss of these professionals in terms of how they could impact the ability for organizations to rebuild post-pandemic. Maybe you could dive a little deeper into that, about what the impact of the loss of these professionals have had on volunteer programs and the organizations themselves, and how are they, if it's possible, how is it possible for organizations to start building back?
So the loss of volunteer engagement professionals, has greatly impacted volunteer programs, because, suddenly the individual or individuals with whom most volunteers first encountered, the person who perhaps onboarded them, maintained those regular communications and advocated for them, for volunteers up the organizational chain, is gone. So I'm, in my role as the director of a volunteer center, I'm hearing from community who are saying, I'm calling organizations and no one's responding, or no one's answering, responding to my email, or no one's picking up the phone. And in some cases, there just isn't anyone there to do that. And in other cases, you've gone from maybe a larger department to a much smaller one, so they just don't have the capacity. And the biggest thing, though, from that loss of knowledge is that the foundation of every successful volunteer program is relationships. It's that relationship building. And with the loss of sort of your chief relationship person or your volunteer manager, it's left many volunteers without that direct point of contact within the organization. And building back needs to be a multi-pronged approach. And it's more than just bringing back your leader of volunteers, or bringing back, volunteers themselves. It's ensuring that the roles, that volunteer roles are valued within an organization, that the role of the volunteer professional is valued. And that's everything from, decent work, appropriate wages, support for ongoing professional development, support within your budget for your volunteer program altogether. I myself have been in roles where, when I brought up, he said, so what's the volunteer budget? They're like, oh, I didn't think about that. Other places, that's very inherent, and that's part of the advocacy work that we continue to do here at PAVRO around this, bringing that forward. But it also means that funders, all levels of funders and senior leadership, need, including boards of directors, really need to commit to reducing the precariousness of being employed as a volunteer manager in the nonprofit sector, and value the contributions of volunteers themselves as integral to their ability to complete, to do their mission in community. That they're not in some cases, they're not a nice to have, they're a need to have, but they do much, much more than just perhaps those more menial tasks that might come to mind when you think about volunteering. Volunteers have a massive amount of skills that they bring to their roles, and have huge impact on an organization's ability to meet their mission. And it's that leader of volunteers, it's that volunteer manager who's helping to make those connections so that everyone succeeds.
Yeah, I was, when we were discussing it earlier, I thought I was quite impressed by the way that you were describing the critical relationship that exists with volunteers, and that over time, it's not, you might be inspired to act as a volunteer and commit your time and efforts to a cause, but over time, it also becomes a critical relationship that becomes part of that sort of feeling of impact, and for feeling as though you're inspired, and as seeing, I guess, your engagement being valued by,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, not just an organization that sometimes feels faceless, that you have these relationships that reinforce what it
Mm-hmm.
is that you're doing and the impact that you're making.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I mean, the leader of volunteers, as I said, builds those relationships. They're often, the ones that are going out and doing the recruitments. They're the face. They can be one of the faces in community, but they're often the face in community that is helping community connect. Your fundraising team is is taking a different approach that way, but your leaders of volunteers or your senior volunteers who are going out and helping to do recruitment, to tell people about the roles and to encourage people to consider giving their time to your organization, that's critical. And then the volunteers themselves, the relationship that they build with your clients, the relationship that they build with your community. So the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, not only disrupted that link between volunteer leader and the volunteers themselves, it also interrupted the relationship between the volunteers and the people that they serve. So again, we're sort of in that rebuild process. And it's been stressful, top down, bottom up. We've all had to learn to do things differently. We've all had to adjust to the various changes and work within, the health and safety guidelines that have been put into place. While at the same time, serving the communities, meeting those essential needs of people. And I think now that things are slowly, stabilizing, it's now is a really fantastic time to sort of look at, okay, what is the impact, and making sure that senior leadership understands that and builds that up into plans, and doesn't make the assumption that they have to go outside of their organization to see success and to be able to affect change. Look inward. You probably got some fantastic volunteers on your team that, with the right supports, are going to help make those impacts, because they know, they're connected to the community in a way that staff are not, and that they can bring their ideas forward. They know what's happening on the ground. So, and again, your leader of volunteers, your volunteer manager, is often that person that helps make those connections, brings that information forward, and sort of keeps things glued together, so that there's that connection between the program that you're delivering and the people that are receiving.
In my experience, in speaking to a lot of leaders of nonprofits, I've learned that the volunteer pool, the people that are volunteering for your organizations, are often very valuable potential recruits as being employees for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, volunteers would be very much, as a member of the community, potentially even a capacity to reach a different and a more dedicated and committed group of donors as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could address that as well.
Sure. Volunteers, people get involved because they're passionate about the cause. And that's often the first reason why they come in, and even very young students, when they come in, often there's a connection. They may not fully understand what it is, but that there's a connection there, and then that's part of our role as the leaders of volunteers to help nurture that and to make sure that we're providing those meaningful experiences. But you're absolutely right, Mary. Those volunteers and community, they are often donors themselves. I mean, I know very few people who volunteer and don't donate somehow, and vice versa. You know, donors also volunteer their time in different ways as well. But they are a huge connection for community. They are a huge lens through which, you know, we can actually know whether or not the efforts that we're putting into place, are they the right ones? The feedback that volunteers provide to say, we're delivering this service in community, or this is what we're hearing from community around what is needed, where efforts need to be placed. I've worked with organizations, our members have worked work at organizations where it's the feedback from the volunteers around what they're seeing in community, what they're hearing from the people that they're supporting, that are affecting, the advocacy work around change in public policy, and how, funds are delivered, and how and where, particular services are provided in community. Advocating for those where services aren't, being able to bring that data forward to say, we've talked to people, we see this. And in many cases, you've also got volunteers, as you say, who are part of the community. So this is personal for them. These are their neighbors. This is their community. These are the young people that are growing up in their community. These are the older adults that have, been there for many, many years and are the foundation of their community. So they're very, very invested in ensuring that everyone, has opportunity, and their way of being able to affect that change is through their volunteer work. So again, being able to engage your volunteers in communication, in connecting with them through various means for them to share what they have experienced, what they're hearing, and what their ideas are. Sometimes in the leadership of organizations, we can fall into the idea that the collective we know best, but we got to make sure that our volunteers are included in that collective we, because then we really will get the full picture.
That's an excellent point. You spoke a bit about policy and how the perspective of volunteers can influence policy. I'd like to take a broader look at this and ask you, are there any governmental policy or more institutional issues that have impacted volunteerism? Are there government policies you think could help with the current situation? And is PAVRO involved in any advocacy in that regard?
For sure. So, so here in Ontario, certainly, the volunteer sector lost its home in government with the election of our current conservative government when they came into power, and that's really had an impact. We no longer have that direct connection with government. That means that the voice of volunteer leaders is muffled at best, and sometimes it's not heard at all. So in some cases, there are things that have come forward that we kind of sit back and shake our heads at, or wonder, what's informing that. And, that dialogue, being able to have that conversation, being able to have somebody to reach out to directly, would definitely benefit us here in Ontario. So I know that's a big thing that our members have brought up, is that loss of connection, to be able to have a channel to be able to say, this is what we're experiencing, this is what we're hearing on the ground, and the direction that is being suggested, or the direction that has been decided on, needs to be modified, or we think this will work because this is going to help X, Y, and Z. Certainly at PAVRO, we partner with a number of different organizations, and most notably the Ontario Volunteer Centre Network and the Ontario Nonprofit Network. So we're very involved in supporting campaigns around decent work. Also, here in Ontario, again, the police record check system, we're continuing to advocate, around that, and to try to find some standardization of that. I know ONN's been doing a lot of work around that, and continuing to advocate for free level 3 police records checks, the vulnerable sector check, which does tend to be the one that most volunteer using organizations are going to be asking for. So currently that is continues to have a fee attached to it, whereas level 1 and level 2 checks, are now free, which is great. So progress is being made, and ONN is continuing their advocacy work, and we're working with them on that. And we continue to also work with our partners around reestablishing that seat on the table. So there certainly has been, some progress has been made, and we continue to encourage our members, to get involved at their local levels to amplify these messages, bringing forward, the experiences that they're having as leaders of volunteers and what their volunteers are experiencing. What are those barriers? Perhaps a barrier to securing volunteers to do their work, are some of those things. Police records checks, for example. As an organization, PAVRO is really advocating around the certification of volunteer engagement professionals. We believe that the more volunteer managers who are certified and the more employers who make certified as that preferred status for these roles when they're recruiting, will increase the value of the profession in the eyes of government and of funders, employers, and volunteers themselves. So PAVRO has had its own certification since about 2000, the certification for volunteer resource managers. And in March of 2020, our membership gave the board the direction to move over from the CVRM to the international certification through the Council of the Certification for Volunteer Administrators, which is managed out of the United States, but it is an international certification. It's the CVA. So we are working with our members and partners on promoting that. And as such, we've had some opportunities to help increase awareness around certification and also support those who are looking for certification. So prior to January of this year, there really wasn't a formalized study group. This is a multiple choice exam that people write. It's a tough exam. I mean, it is a tough exam. It's based on 7 competencies of volunteer engagement, and I've written it. It's a tough one, but purposely so. There's a lot that goes into being, a volunteer leader. So we in partnership with Volunteer Toronto have actually established a CVA study group. So we had our first cohort of attendees this past January, and we're getting ready to welcome our next cohort of attendees starting in August. So we usually run these a couple of months before the exam cycles, which are April and October every year. So this has been another way of helping to, promote the profession, promote the education around the profession, and support those that are looking to take that next step forward in their career with their certification. Within the healthcare sector here in Ontario, certainly certification has been preferred for many years. That was wonderful advocacy work done by my predecessors and previous boards in the early 2000s. And now we're moving that forward, hopefully to have other subsectors adopt certification preferred, which will benefit the organization, which will benefit the volunteers, and help build up volunteerism across the province.
Well, if the pandemic did anything, it certainly is to emphasize the importance of having the people that manage the volunteers in healthcare services and facilities to actually have those skill sets. There's no question. You mentioned barriers, and I wanted to sort of address what barriers to volunteering are really preventing Canadians of various ages. Maybe there's different kinds of barriers depending on the demographic, but what's preventing them from giving back to their communities? What are ways that organizations can mitigate these barriers or confront them and change their approach?
For sure. When I read this question, I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, how much time do we have?" there are so many barriers to volunteering that prevents Canadians of all ages from getting involved. Because one of the things we need to remember right now is, as volunteering is designed currently, it is a privilege. Volunteering is something that's done with people's leisure time, and while it might be in someone's top 10 list of things that they do or that they want to do, but it's probably not in their top 3 or their top 5. And that was a lesson that it took me a long time to learn. I've been doing this a long time. And when I kind of realized that, looking at myself and others, and talking to my volunteers at different organizations, that changed, how I approached, recruiting volunteers and engaging with them. And I think once the nonprofit and voluntary sectors, acknowledge this and build programs with this in mind, those on the receiving end of whatever an organization's mission is going to be, will benefit. Because, we need to be able to make sure that our programs are built, with proper funding for staff and supplies and resources, which includes the training and recruitment of volunteers. But there are lots of barriers, just, in general for folks. And these are probably true for folks right across the country. So transportation, as you mentioned, I'm the director of the Volunteer Center in Halton Region and for the City of Hamilton. And Halton Region currently doesn't have an integrated transit system. So that makes it really challenging, for somebody who might live in our Milton community to get up to Georgetown, or who lives in our Burlington community to get over to Oakville, which doesn't seem like a distance if you have a car, but if you rely on public transit, that becomes, many hours perhaps spent to go and volunteer. And I know that there are areas in Ontario and across the country where, there isn't a transit system at all. So that's a barrier. Language can be a barrier. Organizations that perhaps are not in a position right now to provide their information in more than one language. Shift availability. If you're targeting, your most of your shifts are when most people are working, that'll be a challenge, even if somebody wants to volunteer. Also, sort of unclear role requirements, can be a barrier. If someone's unsure what it is that they're being asked to do, how many hours, what is that role going to entail? Is it going to meet my needs as an individual, which may be, a career, jumping off point for a career, or, wanting to do something different than what my career is. If your position description or your posting isn't very clear, that becomes a barrier to folks getting involved. And then those shift requirements, does this involve a lot of standing, a lot of sitting, a lot of, lifting? Also, again, going back to language, are you asking for things that people will self-select themselves out? We're looking for someone with excellent communication skills, written and verbal. Well, I don't know how many of us, would put ourselves into excellent. And what does that mean for an organization? What does that mean for an individual? And also, again, is it a meaningful role? Every organization has those more menial tasks that need to get done, but are they being balanced with the work, the frontline work? Someone says, I'd really like to work frontline, but you're like, the only opportunity that I have is in the background. Well, how can you switch that up so that there's a balance there to help all of us understand that, not every role is front facing, but not every role is in the background either. So there needs to be that balance. And I think organizations can help mitigate some of these barriers, by being realistic about what's going on in their communities, and finding ways, if they're within their means, to make volunteering accessible. So, for example, I've been working with an organization recently who's been really having challenges with the transportation piece. So we surveyed their current volunteer base to talk a little bit about ride sharing. Is there an opportunity, if someone does drive, has access to a vehicle, would they be willing to pick up another volunteer so they could come and volunteer? Not that you'd go to their home, but maybe that volunteer makes their way to a local library or a common place that they can access, and then they travel together. Benefits the organization. They have the two volunteers perhaps that they need, helps build the relationship between the volunteers themselves. And then, but also an organization who may not think of this, but that maybe that's the advocacy piece that they do with their local government around transportation needs, being able to demonstrate, if we had a better transit system, not only will my organization benefit with volunteers being able to get to us, but look at all the other things that'll happen in community. So I think sometimes it's just thinking, I hate the term outside the box, but that's kind of what it is that thinking about what are the barriers, who's not sitting around your table, who's not engaged in your programs. I know, for example, youth has been a huge challenge with the pandemic. And then it can get comfortable to try to think, okay, well, you know, we'll make these roles 18 years of age and older. Well, let's see how there are opportunities for young people to get involved. This is how we can get them involved in civic engagement. So maybe it makes a change on our part, but it is sitting down. It is change, and it does require everybody at an organization to want to do that, to move forward, to engage volunteers and reduce as many barriers as possible.
Now, I think you've already started this process by looking at what can we do? But I'm wondering if you could sort of list for those that are listening to you now, what are some areas that you generally see that are low hanging fruit or some quick wins that you can make in your organization? And again, it might be just changing perspective or thinking outside the box about how they go about it. But perhaps you can have some examples of that.
Sure. I think the biggest thing the organizations can do is communicate with your volunteers, not just at them. So there's always a lot of information that we want to give to our volunteers. But I think, as we talked about earlier, that idea of engaging them. So, make sure your volunteers are engaged in those discussions when decisions about the work that they do, are happening. So ensure that you've got their voice around the table. Um, you know, like the transportation example, perhaps are there organizations who are doing similar work in your area where perhaps you can volunteer share. I've worked with an organization recently. Sometimes you've got folks who, would like to volunteer multiple days. And because you have such a demand for your services, you're trying to be as equitable as possible. Maybe you've had to think, I can really only have one individual come out, 2 times a week or for 2 shifts or whatever it is. But maybe there's another organization that does similar work that, could use that, has that extra shift. So I think part of it is building up your networks, being connected, and not thinking, and I think organizations and leaders of volunteers, we do this kind of think, these are my volunteers, these are my organization's volunteers. No, they're our community's volunteers, and adopt a vision of ours, and make people available, because that will build up community, that will build up networks. Doesn't necessarily mean that the volunteer is going to jump ship and go and do more with the other organization. They probably won't, because that's becoming meaningful for them if they're looking to do multiple days and your organization as on its own isn't able to do that. So, look at that volunteer sharing if there's a way to do that. Communicate the changes in volunteer availability or interest or whatever to your senior leadership. Don't just assume that they know. Tell them. Gather that data, find that evidence, get that evidence, and use this to advocate for change in your volunteer program. Even better, ask a volunteer to help you in gathering that information from their peers. Because maybe it is, thinking about youth, recently working with an organization that had need to have some work done during the day. They were asking for volunteers to come during the day. When we drilled down, we realized that the tasks themselves would be awesome for young people to do. And so we gathered that information, talked to some of the volunteers, made the case to their senior leadership that, if they could move one staff person from the traditional sort of 9 to 5 role to, a 12 to 8 role instead, they'd be able to meet their needs and have the young people come, in an after-school environment. School in the Halton region tends to get out between 3 and 3:30. I know that's not true necessarily across the country, but that solved their problem. They actually also found a staff member who was like, this would work wonderful because it meets my family's needs too. So again, thinking differently that way. And also recognizing that, nearly everything works better when it's rebooted, including our volunteers. So ensuring that your program builds in buffers, for when volunteers take time away, whether or not it's vacation, emergencies, for their own mental health and wellness. So ensuring that that's built in, to create those positive environments. Because if a volunteer knows, hey, you know what, I'm going to be okay if I go to Heather and say, you know what, this has happened in my life, or this is happening, or I just feel, it's been a bit intense and I need to take a couple weeks, 3 weeks off, for me to go, you know what, that's fine. And, I'll check in with you in a couple of weeks' time and see when you're ready to come back. They're more likely to come back than if they feel they kind of have to leave because they just don't have that flexibility. So it's being flexible. It's finding ways to help volunteers have those meaningful experiences, and it's engaging them in those conversations when those decisions around the work that they do are being discussed and is going to impact them. That's going to build those positive environments where the volunteers you have are going to want to stay, and people are going to be like, how do I get in on this? How do I get involved?
So I want to wrap up by really giving you an opportunity to sort of crystal ball gaze. And I want to ask you that when you think about volunteering, where do you think it's headed in Canada? What are your hopes for the future?
I think people will always volunteer, and I think there's always going to be people willing to lead volunteers informally, both in a paid and in an unpaid capacity. I think what's happening right now is a bit of a reset after the pandemic. It's all groups need an organizer, and in a formal setting, that's often the role of the volunteer manager. And the pandemic has brought forward so many issues with volunteering, some positive, some not so positive, and honestly, some that are a bit toxic. But it's imperative that those conversations continue, and that change continues to happen to reduce barriers, to improve engagement, that funding models are modified to include monies for appropriate staff and volunteer levels. I certainly hope that more young people are going to choose volunteer engagement as a profession. Many who are listening to this today might be like myself, where this is a career you kind of fell into. So I know from PAVRO, we are looking to advocate and work with intentionally to make sure that young people see this as a potential career path for all the fantastic engagements that you have with community, the opportunities to affect change and to work with some absolutely awesome and amazing people. I have met folks through my work as a volunteer leader that I would never have run into, would never have crossed paths with, who have opened my eyes to different ways of doing things, have made me aware of things that I, from my position, wouldn't necessarily see, and has changed my perspective, which has impacted other things that I do, in my personal life and in my professional life. So I firmly believe that, going forward, volunteering is going to be stronger than it was before, and it's going to be more inclusive. It's going to have less barriers, and it's going to really, continue to provide people with opportunities to connect with their communities that they wouldn't get, frankly, in any other capacity.
Well, Heather, you have a wealth of experience, and I've learned so much. Your insight and perspectives on volunteerism in Canada is so appreciated for the nonprofit organizations and certainly our audience for CharityVillage Connects as they seek solutions to these really difficult challenges. So thank you for joining us at CharityVillage Connects.
Thank you so much, Mary, for having me. Have a great day.
You too.